1 Corinthians chapter 3. In chapter 3 that Tim studied last week with you, I was not here. I was with the brethren over at Eastside preaching in their meeting over there, and so missed our meeting here, but had the wonderful opportunity to be over there. And it's always hard for me whenever someone's going to teach my class. I'm usually hesitant to say, all right, pick up where I left off and go. But I had full confidence in Tim that he would do a great job, and he told me he did, and so I'm so thankful that it worked out fine. You have this picture of two, I don't know, it's not really a metaphor. There are two illustrations that Paul uses about building the house of God or about the church growth. The first one is that of farmhands. He said, Apollos and I are farmhands. One planted, one watered, and God gave the increase. It makes no difference who planted. It makes no difference who waters. The difference is God is always the one that gives the increase. And he was trying to get the Corinthians, who in their pride and their partisanship had taken God out of the equation. We are able to get people to grow. We are the ones who have the power and the status, and this has been what Paul is fighting, this divisive partisanship attitude from chapter 1, and he's dealing with it even here. And so he says, look, it doesn't matter who planted, it doesn't matter who watered. What matters is where the increase came from, and it didn't come from human hands. It came from God. So the second illustration he uses is that of building the house. He says, we're building a house together. And there's a foundation that has already been laid. You cannot relay that foundation. God, the divine one, laid Jesus Christ as the foundation. And now we come and we build upon it. And he identifies the difference between those who are wise and those who are foolish by how they build upon that foundation. Some build with good, solid material, and some build with shoddy material, the hay and the straw. And we're reminded very quickly of the three little pigs and the one who built his house out of straw versus the one who built his house out of bricks. And we know even from the children's story that the straw and the hay cannot stand the buffeting of time. The same is true in the church. There are some who are builders, who are teachers in the Lord's church, and they are building with stubble. And there are some in the church who are building with bricks. The difference between them, those who are building with bricks focus their converts' eyes and hearts upon the cross of Christ. And those who are building with straw and stubble are focusing their eyes upon their personal reputations, upon what they can do, their own status and social status before the church. And so there are those who just have an ability to draw all men unto them. They have a magnetic personality. They are patrons of the arts, and they gather people to their side, and they are building division and parties within the church. And he says, when you build that, that's the straw, that's the hay, that's the part that's going to be destroyed. Paul would say in Philippians 1, he says, some preach the cross of envy, seeking to add to my burdens. But in the end, Paul says that to me, the attitude from which they're preaching Christ doesn't affect me. Christ is still preached. The gospel is still out there. Even if someone is preaching with the wrong motive and the wrong attitude, as long as they're preaching Christ, the truth is getting out there. Now, he does say, basically on the day of judgment, they will be judged for their wrong attitudes, but at least the cross of Christ is preached. It's the same basic thing here. There are some who are building wisely by pointing people to the cross, and there are some who are building foolishly by pointing people to the wisdom of human wisdom and earthly wisdom. And then when that judgment comes, what's going to happen? Those that are built upon human personalities will be burned up, And it might be that those teachers actually do get into heaven. They may be scarcely saved, but because of their foolish building, the part of the building that they have built has been burned up. But those who built wisely on the cross of Christ, which is foolishness to the world, by the way, are those that are going to stand the test of time. And so then he comes down to verse 16 and 17. He says, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple." And so he has this picture that, here we're building this church. We're building this building up. It's not built of clay and mortar. It's built of what? Souls, people. And this collective people, he says, is what? The temple of God. He doesn't say the temple of God. He just says God's temple. That's significant because he's not talking about the temple of God that replaces the one in Jerusalem. He's not even talking about the temple of God that replaces these false pagan temples in the city of Corinth. He's using it in its most generic sense. What was a temple? What happened in the temple, whether it was the temple of God in Jerusalem or the temple of Apollos or the temple of Athena? What was the purpose of a temple? Okay, for people to come together with God in unity, and whether you're talking about a false god, it was to come in together in unity for this false god, or you're talking about the Jews coming together in unity for the true God. But it was also something else. It was a physical structure. Obviously, people can come together without the physical structure. What was the idea? What did that add to it? I ask. What did the physical structure add to it? And I think it was the visual impact. This was the place. It was, if you were seeking healing from God, where would you go? You would go to God's temple. If you were seeking healing from Apollos, you would go to Apollos' temple. If you were seeking to pray to Athena, you would go to Athena's temple. The temple stood kind of as an advertisement for the deity that was represented there. And now he's saying to the Corinthians, you are God's temple. You are the gathering place of unity and the face of God to the community. Does that make sense? You fulfill that purpose. You as the church fulfill the purpose of advertising God to the community and as coming together in unity. And so then he says in verse 17, but what? If anyone destroys God's temple. God's presence is in his temple, and he says you are going to destroy the presence of God. How do we destroy God's temple? Well, keep it in its context. What's happening in Corinth? Division. They're fighting with one another. False teachers. Pride and arrogance. That's how you destroy God's temple. You break down the unity and the presence of God in the community. You destroy God's temple. And some have suggested, well, this word really just means to damage. It's the same word he uses at the end where he says, if you do that, what happens? God will destroy you. And he doesn't just mean damage. He's talking about destruction in hell. When we bite and devour one another and mutilate the body of Christ, divide up by parties and division, status and power, we are destroying the face of God's temple to the community. And in so doing, or the result is, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, God's temple is separated. It's holy. It's set apart. And he says, you are that temple. You are supposed to be set apart. Set apart from what? Again, the background of Corinth was that patronage, that individual power status, that ability to have a crowd follow you as a leader. And then over here was another man, and he was vying for that attention and vying for that power that was underneath him. They were not set apart from that mentality. That was the problem with the church at Corinth. They had not separated from that competition with one another. And as a result, he says, look, God's temple is set apart. You need to be set apart that way. You need to put away these carnal attitudes. It was, it was Seneca, one of the Roman poets, who said, no house is so strong, no state so enduring, that it cannot be fundamentally overthrown by animosity and division. Even people in the world understood at that time that when there is animosity and division within the house, that the house was going to fall. How did Jesus describe it? He said, a house divided against itself will not stand. And that's what we're seeing here. So he goes on in verse 18. He says, you are supposed to be holy, so let no one deceive himself. It's one thing to be deceived by someone else, or to allow yourself to be deceived. But look what he's saying. Don't deceive yourselves. It's not just that people are out there teaching false doctrines and therefore deceiving you. It's that you have allowed yourself to be deceived by yourself, that you are more important than you really are. That you're more important than the planter or the waterer. That you're more important than the one who is building up on the foundation. Do not let yourself be deceived. If anyone among you thinks he is wise in this age, or wise according to this world, let him become a fool, so that he may become wise. Remember, we said in this whole discussion in chapters 1 through 4, the focus on what wisdom, the wise people. When he says, if you think that you are wise according to this age, or wise according to this world, you are by cunning and craftiness, you have climbed the social ladder. You are at the leadership or on a pedestal in the church at Corinth, and you've got enough people below you to be called a faction or a following, and yet in the same church there's another pedestal with another leader with another faction and following. Let him become a fool according to what? Right, by the world standards. Become a fool by the world standard. Give up your pride, give up your position, give up your status, that you may become what? Wise. Wise according to God, right? Not wise according to the world. For the wisdom of this world is folly with God. For it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. The wisdom of this world is folly with God. We saw that earlier in chapter 1 and verse 20 and other passages. And there's a similar discussion given in Romans chapter 8 where he starts talking about the mind of this world and the mind of the flesh. The world view, how we see this world. If our mind is focused upon spiritual things or if it's focused upon carnal things. It's a very similar situation. And so he quotes here from Job chapter 5 and verse 13. And the gist of it here is he catches the wise in their craftiness or cunningness, some translations have. What is craftiness or cunningness? What do we normally think of when we hear those words? Okay, has an element of deception that maybe we're trying to get ahead, not necessarily breaking the rules, but if we can find a loophole, or if we can skate by breaking the rules, maybe just, bend them a little bit, that's craftiness. That's the cunningness. Can we do that without God knowing? Job had said it Centuries before Paul has to say it here, but he quotes, and he's saying the same thing. Humans and their cunning and their craftiness, when they think that they're getting by with it, God knows. He gives us another quote, this one from Psalm 94 and verse 11. Again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are futile, or in the original language in the Old Testament, they are as a breath, that there is no weight, there is no significance, they are like the wind, there's no solid effect, and they're only here for a moment, and then it's gone. Human wisdom is temporary. I've seen that in my own life. When I was growing up, elementary school, we learned about the 4 food groups. And nowadays, it's not 4 food groups, it's an entire pyramid, and I can't even begin to tell you all about them. Because human wisdom has changed. Eggs are good for you, eggs are bad for you. Bacon better be good for you, because I like bacon, right? Human wisdom changes. We see the fickleness of human wisdom. And he says here that God looks at it and he knows from the very beginning that human's wisdom, well, it's like the breath. It's like the wind. It's futile. So let no one boast in men, for all things are yours. Well, we know what it means to boast. And we can see their attitude. I am of Paul. I am of Apollos. I am of Cephas. I am of Christ. They're boasting, but what are they boasting in? Men. So you can see Paul is drawing this conclusion. He's bringing the lesson home now. He says, let no one boast in men. And then it kind of takes a little bit of a twist that we're almost not expecting. For all things are yours. We would almost expect Paul to say, just don't worry about it. But he comes in and he says, all things are yours. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas. Look, he mentions it in chapter 2. He mentioned it in chapter 1. He's using these personalities over which they are dividing. And he says, whether it's Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours. And you are Christ's, and Christ is God's. What does he mean to say, all is yours? What do you think he means? Well, to me, he's telling them the good way. Don't boast in men, for all is yours. Whether you're talking about Paul, Paul is yours. Apollos is yours. Cephas is yours. Why? Because they are what? Servants. In fact, that's exactly what he says. If you take the chapter break out, this is how one should regard us. Us. Who? Paul, Apollos, and Cephas. That's the antecedent to the pronoun. This is how I want you to regard us or consider us as what? Leaders in the church and the pedestals of the community, right? What does he say? As servants and stewards. What he's trying to get them to see is that when they pledge allegiance to one person like Apollos or Cephas, or if they're dividing up from one leader to the next leader, whether it's Apollos or Cephas or Paul or some other leader in Corinth, which may very well have been, they were limiting themselves. In other words, Paul and Apollos, these men worked for the church. All of them, not just one of them. All of them worked for the church. And their efforts and their influences were for the church. And when you say, well, I'm just of Paul, then you are eliminating for yourself the gift which God has given to you in the servanthood of Peter and of Apollos and of other preachers and other workers. This is how I want you to regard us, as servants to everyone, as servants to you. Well, they might already think that Paul and Cephas and Apollos are underneath them, but he's not saying, think of us as underneath you. He's really encouraging them to think of what of themselves. That just as we are servants, what? You are servants. Just as we give ourselves to serve God, we want you to give yourself to serve God. It was a whole new philosophy to them. But it's exactly what Jesus had preached. Whoever will become first must what? Be last. And whoever would become the leader or the king of all must what? Become a servant of all. Very, very much the doctrine of Christ, that as in Christ, when we become part of the church, it's not about aligning ourselves in certain parties. It's not about exalting ourselves to certain statuses. It is about giving ourselves to the work and the service of the church. And so he even says, as he goes further, he says, moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful or trustworthy. We do the job that has been handed us to do. What job was given to Paul and Apollos and Cephas and John and, preach the gospel. To take this message of the cross, which is the gospel, right? Take this message of the cross and that is foolishness to the world, and allow people of the world to come to a knowledge and an understanding of the cross. That's how Paul would be measured as faithful. That's how Peter would be measured as faithful. Not measured by how many converts they get, but by submitting themselves to serve God in the church, preaching and sharing that gospel. But with me, he says, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. Paul uses here two tribunals that are worthless about judging. He actually, let me mention, in verses 3 and 4, he uses this word for judging, anakrino, which has to do with finding criticisms at the beginning. And have you ever noticed when people start to judge others, it often starts with small criticisms, the preliminary criticisms, and then they eventually escalate until someone is judged wholly or completely, not H-O, but W-H-O, wholly or completely judged. And so in verse 3 and 4, he uses this word for the preliminary criticisms, the small tit-for-tat type things that we find sometimes in the church with the bickering back and forth and the pettiness that sometimes Christians get into. And he says, this pettiness, it's a small thing that I am receiving such pettiness. And it's not that he is elevating himself and saying, I'm too good for your pettiness. Rather, he's saying, in reality, the only judgment that matters is God's reality. And it's the only one I really care about. It's not just that he's developing a thick skin. It's that he's trying to convince them to look only to God's judgment. Because the judgment right now that they're following is, how will this be perceived in the Corinthian community? If I'm head of the church, that's a mighty big body. And people in Corinth, in the community, will see that I'm the head of the church, and they'll know that I'm somebody. You see, that's the small judgments. Paul says, if I'm judged by you or the human courts, the courts of the land of Corinth, that means nothing to me. I would put those two together, them and the human courts, as one tribunal. But there's another tribunal that he says I'm not worried about. What is it? Yeah, but what does he say specifically? In fact, I do not even judge myself. I'm not even concerned about how I judge myself. Now, he goes on to verse 4 and says that, I look at myself. I'm not aware of anything against myself, but I am not hereby acquitted. That doesn't acquit me before the Lord. There is one judgment that matters. And he uses the word for the judgment. There's one final verdict I'm concerned about. Who? God. I'm not worried about how I judge myself. I'm not concerned about how you judge me. We all need to be concerned about God. And it's not that Paul is putting them down. He's actually drawing them after himself. You shouldn't be concerned about these human criticisms. You shouldn't be concerned about the criticisms even that you have of yourself. You should be concerned about, as I am, the judgment of God. That's what's important. That's where we stand. Even though he doesn't know of anything against himself, he says, it is the Lord. I'm not going to give up and say, well, since I don't know of anything against myself, I can just keep going as I've been going. He's looking forward to that final judgment, the judgment of God. Therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God. The judgment here in verse 5 is the judgment of God, as we would think the final verdict. Jesus knows the hearts of men. John 2:25, right? For he did not need that people tell him what they believe, for he knew the hearts of men. He already knows our hearts. He knew the hearts of those that were that day. He knows our heart today. He knows more about us than we know about ourselves. And that's why he says, don't pronounce judgment before time, because on the day when the Lord comes and judgment is pronounced, what's going to happen? He's going to bring to light what? Things now hidden in darkness. I don't think the darkness here is necessarily moral evil, as oftentimes it's found in the New Testament, but rather just the things that we may not know. Things that we don't remember. Human memory is somewhat faulty. Sometimes we tell a lie long enough, we believe it. James, that is a great point. These are the hidden things. And not just the hidden things that, the things that are hidden from us, but another aspect, he says, the purposes of our hearts. When God said in Isaiah that Nebuchadnezzar was going to be his minister, in Jeremiah, he said Nebuchadnezzar was going to be his minister. Did Nebuchadnezzar come at that time to acknowledge God? Was the purpose of his heart to bring glory and honor to God and punish the nation of Israel? No. Even though he did God's bidding, his purpose was not to glorify God. Even though we may follow the word of God, if the purpose of our heart is not pure, we'll still be judged. And so he says, don't judge before time. Then each one will receive his commendation, or the word praise. He'll receive his praise from God. That's ultimately what matters. In chapter 3 and verse 8, it says, he who plants and he whose waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to the labor. He's going to receive that wage. In verse 14, he mentions the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives. He will receive a reward. There's a reward. There's a wage that is coming. And he's foreshadowing that in chapter 3. And here in chapter 4, he finally says, and here's the reward. What is it? The praise of God. The good sayings and the blessings from the Lord. Jesus describes them, come home, thou good and faithful servant. to receive the praise of God. You remember in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, the second section of that sermon, he starts talking about those who sound the trumpet when they give alms so that people will see it. And what does he say? They have their reward. And those who pray on the street corner to be seen of others and receive the praise of men, they have their reward. They have their praise. That's the commendation they're getting, and that's all the commendation they're getting. It is from this earth. Paul says, but when you wait and live so as to God judge you as opposed to man's judgment, if you are living according to God's commendation as opposed to the world's commendation, then you will receive a praise that is much greater than this world could ever give. And if you consider the divisions in Corinth, those divisions partly rested upon the praises of men, didn't they? I'm of Paul. I'm of Apollos. I'm of Cephas. And they were exalting themselves. And he says there's a praise that's worthy, and it's not the praise of men, it's the praise of God. So in verse 6 is it's a little bit odd. There's some words in here that are not used in other places. There's a phrase here that seems to indicate one thing, but it's not there. And it starts here. He says, I have applied all these things to myself and Apollos. Some translations say, I've transferred these things. The word is more closely to the idea of transferred. And I think what Paul is saying is that just as we've been speaking of putting away the division, putting away the judgment, putting away the partisanship, that's how we live. That's how Paul or Apollos and Paul live. They're not trying to get a faction to follow them. They are trying to serve the church as a whole. And so basically he's saying, I'm not asking you to do anything that we are not already doing. It's about the best translation we can get, that idea. And that's why some have translated it applied. I've applied these things, or we've applied these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit. He is... Paul and Apollos, we're not sure that they were the only factions in Corinth. In fact, probably weren't the Apollos faction or the Paul faction. By the rest or the next paragraph, it appears that there are factions of men that we don't know their names. People who were in the church at Corinth and they were gathering their following all along. But Paul is saying, look, this is how we live. And the idea is not that he comes right out and rebukes everyone for every little comment they've made, but rather instead of setting forth or condemning the negative example, he's setting forth the positive example in himself and Apollos. And he's saying what? Come on, follow this example. It is to your benefit, your heavenly spiritual benefit, if you will follow the example of me and Apollos. And then he says, that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up in favor of one against another. And that phrase, to not go beyond that which is written. The word go is not in there. The word beyond is not in the original. The statement is actually that you may learn the not beyond what is written. And the article at the beginning of the phrase, not beyond what is written, is used most often in the New Testament to bring up a quote of something. And so there's a principle here, not go beyond what is written. And there's all kinds of ideas about that statement is not written in the Old Testament anywhere directly. Was that an axiom or a pithy saying that was around Corinth at the time that was common knowledge to everyone? Well, if it was, it's not found in any other writings from Corinth. I think that he is referring to the Scriptures, because Paul uses this phrase, what is written, many times in his letters. This is the only time, however, that he uses it without a direct quotation from the Old Testament. So you can see how it's a little odd, but I think what Paul is doing is he's still drawing that conclusion. He's still bringing it to a close, and he says, now I'm telling you, don't go beyond what is written. Well, Paul, which verse are you talking about? What scripture should we not go beyond? And if you take this introduction as a whole from chapter 1 to here, in chapter 1 and verse 19, he quotes from Isaiah 29 and verse 14, and he says, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. And in chapter 1 and verse 31, he quotes from Jeremiah 9. He says, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. Then in chapter 2 and verse 9, he says, what eye has not seen, nor ear has heard. And he's quoting from Isaiah 64. And then in chapter 3 and verse 19, he catches the wise in their craftiness in Job 5:13. And in 3 and verse 20, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are futile. Psalm 94 and verse 11. And if you take the cumulative force of all of those verses, those 5 verses that he quotes from the Old Testament, those 5 passages from the Old Testament, it places a strict limit on human pride, and it calls us to trust in God. Isn't that what Paul is trying to get them to do? To eliminate the pride and the arrogance that is causing the division. Put limits on pride and trust rather in God. Godly wisdom. The judgment that comes from God. Don't go beyond these things which were written. Keep your pride in check and keep your faith in God. That's the sum of it, right there. Why? The end of verse 6. That none of you may be puffed up or filled with pride. But it carries the idea of like what you would do with a balloon, and you would blow it up and it begins to puff up with air, right? It gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you think, wow, that's huge. And yet, there's nothing inside. There's no greater weight. It's still nothingness. And he says, you're puffed up with air. Ironically, he referred to their actions when they said that they were spiritual. He says, I wanted to talk to you, but you think you're spiritual, but you're not really spiritual. The word spiritual comes from the word spirit, which is also properly translated wind or air. And I think the irony is Paul is saying, I don't want you to be puffed up with false arrogance and pride. I want you to truly be spiritual. I want you to be what you think you are. And he kind of deflates their balloon in verse 7. For who sees anything different in you? What do you have that you did not receive? If then you received it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? It's 3 questions. Who, what, and why. Who makes you special? Well, who makes us special? God. We are special because of our relationship with God. Not because of my wisdom, not because of my shrewdness and my craftiness, not because of my following, not because of my wealth or my money, not because of those things. I'm special because of God. God makes me special. What have you received? Or what do you have that you did not receive? What possession do you have that is so great? Your salvation. Did you save yourself? No. Did you buy yourself into salvation? No. Where did you receive that great gift? God. God makes you special. God has given you all that you received. Whenever you're puffed up in pride, you are denying that God is the one who has given you all the things that matter. So in verses 8 through 13, he uses this hyperbole, we might say, to undermine their misplaced boasting in themselves and juxtapose that to the cruciform life of the apostles. They are living the cross according to the wisdom of the cross. Verse 8, already you have all you want. Already you have become rich. Without us you have become kings, and would that you did reign so that we might share the rule with you. Philo, one of the Jewish historians of the 2nd century, said, the proud person considers himself superior in riches, or to all, in riches, estimation, beauty, strength, wisdom, temperance, justice, eloquence, and knowledge, while everyone else he regards as poor, disesteemed, unhonored, foolish, unjust, ignorant, outcast, and good for nothing. That's exactly how the Corinthians looked at other people. And Paul is saying, look at our lives. Already, or so quickly, you're so quickly come to this point already. Contrast that with what Paul is saying. Look at the long, arduous struggles that we, the apostles, have come through. You think you reign, you think you have it all, you think you have arrived. Look at what we have gone through and we continue to go through, because the life of the cross demands the suffering of this world. It always has. All that would live godly in this present world shall suffer persecution. 2 Timothy 3 and verse 12. Suffering is the way of the Christian. The glory that they were wanting and the glory that they thought they had, that's for the life hereafter. Suffering is for the life here and now. I think that God has exhibited us, the apostles, as last of all, like men sentenced to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, to angels, and to men. Look at what we have already faced, the struggles of the apostles. These are the ones that he holds up as praiseworthy. How can they boast if they've received their blessings through the apostles? The apostles, he says, we are set low, and you've puffed yourself up because of the blessings of lower men. When we think about the hardships of the apostle, it offers that positive role model of what it means to live the cross, because the way of the cross is modeled by the apostles themselves. Last of all, shows that social rank. We're living the cross, and so we're not going to be the best. The spectacle and the sentencing is like the Colosseums and the old gladiatorial games. Except this isn't just a Colosseum in Rome. He says this is a cosmic Colosseum. And the world and angels and mortals are looking on. And they see us abused and in hardship. We have become all things, like the scum of the world, the refuse of all things, he says, for one purpose, so that God can be glorified in our lives. That's the wisdom of God. Foolishness to the world, but that is the wisdom of God. We'll pick up in verse 14 next week. Appreciate your attention.